and welcome to the second episode of Sorcerous Intent with me, Seth Salem of the Visible College. We're very pleased to have the illustrious and illuminated Alan Chapman as our guest host today. And our practitioner is Danny Buckler, one of my oldest friends who is a stage magician who is also a real magician, as we would say. So it's a pleasure to both have you. Alan is the author of many works, including Magia, received in Greece, and has recently published or republished The Baptist's Head through Aeon Books, and his forthcoming The Collected Magical Works of Aleister Crowley will be published biannually. So we're very excited to have him with us today. Alan, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And Danny, thank you for being here as well.
No, thank you, Seth. Thank you for asking me. This is actually joyous because I'm getting to interact with someone that I've been following for years. So it's really quite the treat. Thank you.
Yeah, I mentioned when Alan spoke at the Thelemic Symposium that back along when The Baptist's Head was coming out, it was a big deal in the OTO and the AA because we had a lot of approaches to the Holy Guardian Angel, and I think it was a little bit surprising for you, Alan, because you didn't get much response in the IoT at the time. But so it's really good to have you here from our perspective, and thank you for coming on. So without further ado, let's move on to our discussion. So Danny, by all means, ask Alan what you will.
Well, just to get things started, I've followed you, Alan, from the Baptist Heads days. All this IoT, OA3, but I know nothing of this. I don't want to know anything of this. I don't know what their various things are. But when I was sort of, you really spoke to me as a voice. When I was looking at occult stuff online, because you were normal. That was the big thing. Like you spoke like a person. You were speaking about these incredibly esoteric things, but with no pretension about it. You and your mate Duncan off having adventures and stuff. And so I followed that. I have these bad puppies.
Oh wow, the OG.
Absolutely, the OGs, mate. When I got them, they were like 20 quid a piece.
Yeah.
And then of course they went up to being going for like 10 grand on eBay. And now, thanks to this, they're back to being £20 a piece. So thank you for destroying my retirement.
Well, it was part of the intention in publishing it, was to make them accessible again, given the silly prices for the originals.
Oh, absolutely. They deserve to be accessible. And obviously, there's this bad puppy, which I've studied for the last couple of years since I got it. As you can know, this is the well-thumbed volume that's been around the world. I've actually read this in the island where it was channeled. Sat on the beach. So, I've got a lot of things to sort of ask you about. And the first thing is probably, how can I put this into words? You seem to have, from my perception, constantly been in a process of simplifying. In that the original, when I was reading your early stuff, it's the rituals are all quite elaborate and there's a lot of group, and you seem to have got it down to literally some sitting practices and another couple of just 2 or 3 key things. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yeah, I think that's superficially correct in terms of what it might look like from the outside with the practices, but things that look simple, usually under the surface, are actually quite sophisticated. And it's a difficult thing to express things simply. And that's certainly been the process that I've been engaged in, which is, it might be best illustrated actually by picking up on a word that you used when you referenced the Magia book. For the listeners that don't know, I went through a process from 2005 onwards with a friend of mine where we practiced the invocation of the Holy Guardian Angel. We went through a process which we captured and described with the Baptist's Head. I then became a teacher for about 10 years, leading people through the same process, not strictly from a magical perspective, however. But then about 2019, I went to Greece, did a retreat, and spoke a book. And the content of that retreat became the book Magia. Right. And that's principally the practice that I do now and what I teach students. Now, Danny, you mentioned the word channeled. right? Now, I think. Sorry, go on.
That was right. Yeah. Is that
No.
a correct phrase? Okay.
No. So, but it's good. It's good for illustration's sake. In terms of what we're talking about, in terms of things being, it looking like a process of becoming simpler, over time. Yeah. So, the difference between channeling and then what the nature of this book is, and I might use the word prophetic or prophecy to describe that which is different from channeling. So in magical practice, you can invoke an entity or evoke an entity, depending on what you're going for, and the person that is either as a visionary capacity or is acting as the available means of manifestation for communicating with the entity can express messages or information that they receive from that entity, right, without understanding what it actually means. So it's possible if you speak to an entity and ask it a question that maybe you get some kind of visionary answer, or maybe it's auditory or something like that. But it doesn't matter whether the vessel or the channeler actually understands what the message is. They're merely passing it on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, right. And no doubt there are lots of examples of channeled texts or other things like that, where there is a someone who's acting as this mouthpiece for something else that's speaking. Right now, in contradistinction to that is what I'm calling prophecy or something like that, where what is spoken comes downstream from the immediate realization of what's being expressed. So what I mean by that is that what is spoken is already known and understood by the person speaking, which is different from channeling, which is where you can hear the words and pass them on, but you don't have the understanding of what it means.
Ah.
Right? There's no participation in the nature that's actually producing the words.
Got you.
Right? So they're actually opposites. They're the opposite to each other. Now, on that retreat, I had one drama that I was engaged in for that entire retreat, and it can be summed up by a question, which is who's speaking? Who is it who's speaking? Am I speaking, or is something else speaking? By the end of that retreat, that had resolved so that the question didn't arise anymore, because it's a silly question. But this idea of going through a process where you participate in a larger or a greater or more profound nature, right, and then finding a way to put that into words, we could say that's the whole process I've been going through since 2005, and what it means to do magical practice. You're putting something into words. The greater the depth or the growth of that process, right? You would hope, if you're doing it right, that the cultivated speech or the way that you might put it into words becomes more sophisticated over time because of the increasing depth, right, of the growing grasp of the terrain that you're traveling through, but becomes simpler in expression. Because part of grasping that terrain is not just dealing with the various different particulars you might encounter, but the recurring universal structure of that domain. Right. So when you see a pattern repeating this, and by universal I mean it always occurs, you always see the same pattern. So there's a universal structure to the process of the great work, or what we might call waking up or awakening or non-dual realization, or whatever term we might want to use from whatever tradition for describing this profound process of realization that I'm talking about. So much so that you can allow a spiritual experience that you might wonder, right? You can allow a spiritual experience to disclose its own nature with a very particular kind of practice, such that you see what the structure is. You see what the structure is, and then you know what it is. You'll know what kind of spiritual experience it is. And I've seen that repeated hundreds of times with hundreds of students, that there's this universal structure. And you see the structure popping up, in the various different traditions in the spiritual literature. That there's this universal structure to it. But it's always the case that there are particulars, unique particulars to each individual going through the process. And it's this marriage of the universal with the particular, that is the spiritual adventure or the magical adventure that we're engaged in. So the process that I went through was one of a growing depth and appreciation of the process, but a simpler expression of what it is that I was being exposed to. Now, there is an esoteric element to this where it's not just a human being. The process isn't just about a human being doing their best to describe what they're encountering. I mean, that's part of it, but also part of it is recognizing that process that I'm talking about, the reality and then its expression, is actually also part of that universal structure. So people might have heard of this from spiritual traditions, but in various different ways. But one obvious way is the idea of the logos, or the word, right? You have the God, and then the expression of God or creation itself is expressed through the word. So it's a movement from silence to speech. That's the nature of creation. So you can see that there's a recapitulation of a profound structure to reality, and we do it as individuals. And a key part of that is you saying yes to that process. It's not forced on you, but we say yes to it. And us doing these practices, this is a way of saying yes to it. And then the kind of experiences we have are commensurate with your capacity to deal with that level of growth. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So a long answer to your question, but hopefully that distinction between channeling and I'm using the term prophecy for it because that's what traditionally a prophet is supposed to do. They put into words what it is that they participate in, and speak from that place, so that there's no separation, from the speech and that which the speech is describing, versus just channeling. With channeling, you can speak to anything. There's all kinds of things that you can talk to, ranging from things you might think of as beneficial all the way to things that are intentionally malicious. The difference, and then the difference, of course, is that if you know the nature from which you're speaking from first, before the speech happens, there's no doubt, at least as the speaker, as to what it is that's being said, or the nature of what's being said.
So would you say that it's part of the relationship between the source and the person acting as a prophet, and the agency of that person in the reception, which is one of the functions to work on when looking to receive and transmit in that way?
If I understand your question, then yes, it requires conscious participation by a human being sufficiently that I want to preface it by saying this, because using this term prophet or prophecy or that kind of a thing, obviously there can be a strong aversion to the use of that term, people who might describe themselves in that way, but I would rather focus on using that term to describe the process. So if you're a complete beginner, right, and you first start doing practice, the practice has that prophetic structure to it. It's a prophetic process. The details of what's said and the scope of what's said is commensurate with your process of growth. That's all. Like, the structure remains exactly the same. So at first, the things you have to deal with are your own delusions, your own awakenings, your own spiritual experiences, how well you do with that practice, putting that into words as part of the practice, right? And it's small because that's the appropriate terrain for you to play in, when you're first learning the stuff. As the process proceeds, then that circle hopefully grows wider and wider, until eventually it might contain other people, and that's the function of being a teacher. But the process is just the same, and it might look radically different from one end to the other. Like, you have people who they have no spiritual experience. What's being described is foreign to them, in terms of these texts and so on. And at the other end, you've got someone who's like participating in the nature of God and speaking a teaching that sounds profound and esoteric in its content. And it's like, how do you get from one to the other? And they look like they're different from but it's actually just the same process. It's just the same thing. And it's worth keeping in mind that the participation of the person in this process, if we understand it from the process itself, allow it to disclose its own nature in terms of this universal structure that I talked about, you always find that the person is remains within a certain domain in terms of understanding cosmology or the structure of things. One basic way of putting it is like this: you have reality and then you have appearance. You have reality and you have appearance. You can think of reality as like a light and appearance as like a shadow. We're interested in realizing the nature of the light. We're in a world of shadow and we want to realize the nature of the light, right? We want to bring the light here. We want to realize it such that we end up like stars in the night sky, as imagery.
Yeah.
A big mistake, however, is to confuse the human being with the light, right? We're actually part of the darkness, part of the shadow, part of the night sky. Our function is to say yes to participating in the nature of that light, right? And to that extent, like stars, we're like lamps in the darkness. So we want to bring the light, but we don't confuse ourselves with the light, the human being with the light. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yes,
So,
very much so.
Yeah, I want to make that clear because there's this process is full of pitfalls, as you might imagine. Inflation, it happens a lot, especially when you have a spiritual experience, when you confuse the two. It's important to understand that the light is an inheritance. It's your inheritance. It's your fundamental nature. However, as soon as you ascribe I to that light, to that inheritance, you're taking something from the domain of silence and putting it into speech. You're taking it from the domain of reality and putting it into appearance. And suddenly you can say you've it's kind of like a curse. You open your mouth to speak and it's a curse because what you've just said now is incorrect.
Right.
What you've just said now has bound you to a certain limitation that wasn't there before.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of problems can come out of that. And I think the car crash of 20th century spirituality with the various different teachers who've taught non-dual stuff, right? It's been an absolute car crash is a great expression or an example of what it is that I'm talking about. If you don't have a lineage or a context or a way of making sense of these things, you can make lots of mistakes with bad consequences. And one of those is to take where you find yourself in your process, especially if it is profound, right? And you take that to be yourself. That means you're going to stop there. And not only will you stop there, but you'll become inflated in that position. So just to finish this thought off, I like to say, if you think you're a prophet, you think too little of yourself because you've limited yourself to an idea or to a what can we say? A natural part or activity of the process, right? But there's something beyond it. There's something even beyond that notion, you see. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
So what I love about your stuff, particularly Magia, which is, I'm guessing Magia is the cutting edge of where you're at now?
Yeah. I mean, I would, yeah. I for 10 years when I was teaching, when the Baptist Head ended, and then I spent 10 years teaching, I was going through a process where I was constantly trying to put into words what I was going through, but I always had the sense that it wasn't it. And that took about 10 years. Then when Magia came along, you could say I had exhausted all of my best efforts at trying to express that process. I did all the usual stuff that you're supposed to do. I was on the spiritual lecture circuit. I was teaching in the States, on the coasts, as you do. I had an interactive gamified learning platform. I had a research program. I had all this stuff, and I'm putting it into words. It's growing. I'm putting it into words, but I always had this sense this isn't it. This isn't it. And then at a certain point, all of that stuff came crashing down. And it was only when I went to did the retreat in Greece. It was a very small retreat. I knew that I had nothing else left to say. I had nothing else left to say. I was very happy to go there and sit on a chair and say nothing if I had nothing to say. Now, I will say, but before I did that retreat, a spiritual or an astral representative of the Great White Brotherhood or the AA, or Crowley's lineage, to which the practice of invoking the Holy Guardian Angel belongs, right?
Mhm.
An entity that we'd worked with between 2005 and 2009, me and Duncan during the Baptist Head days, he turned up to tell me I needed to do a magical working with a particular god. During that working, I was told that I was going to reveal a secret I'd never told to anyone before, and it was a dodecahedron. It's got 12 sides, something like this. This led up to doing this retreat. So everything crashed down. Then something else turned up, almost as if to say, you never needed to do all of that stuff. But part of it seems to be having to exhaust the playing out of the delusion that you can make up for an absence that isn't really there, apart from the fact that you believe it is, right? You have to exhaust that or play that through, and then it revealed the thing you thought was missing actually isn't, and actually it's better than anything you could have done. And that's the book Magia. So when the book came along, it was the end of this process of trying to express or put into words the best way of describing the process of waking up, the great work, the practice, that kind of a thing. So since 2019, I don't have that concern anymore. It's just not there. Rather, there's just the unfolding of something that's happening. Started with the Magia book. That segued into the creation of a new expression or lineage of the AA. And now that's actually moved into going back to Crowley's works. Me personally editing them and putting them into a sequence that I think best captures the essence of his work. And it'll be a 10-volume series that will come out over the next 5 years, hopefully biannually, like the original Equinox. We didn't plan that. It's just sort of turned out that way.
Yeah.
The first edition of which will be Magic Without Tears, which will come out in March. And that involved me last year. Part of that work was exploring Crowley's life. It was like excavation work to discover what was really going on there. And there's a profound connection between what Crowley was doing and Magia that I didn't suspect. But yes, so what was your question?
I've forgotten, but I'm just sitting here riveted.
So the work last year, which led up to your lecture at the Thelemic Symposium, was fascinating to me, and we met a couple of months before to discuss the process you'd gone through, where we'd invited you to speak and you weren't sure what you were going to speak on in the process of the work on the book. You found exactly what you wanted to speak on, which was like to me both, I suppose, professionally as a Thelemite and someone who uses the headless rite, or the Bornless, and also as somebody who's made my own ritual group and framework. It was both sort of personally and professionally fascinating that you had come to that understanding of the process Crowley went through with the Holy Guardian Angel and how it relates to Magia. So I suppose we could look into that a little bit more in terms of the work you did to research the headless rite and going back to ancient Thebes. That's has the potential to hugely influence the way people look at Crowley's work with the invocation of Horus and the reception of the Book of the Law. What do you think the most important thing people can take away from that is?
I mean, I would say for people who are interested, there is of course the video of my talk. The talk itself is quite a condensed version of the research that people will find in Magic Without Tears, in the introduction to Crowley's life, and then the references and the notes that back that up. So I won't go in too much depth into that. Otherwise it would take up the rest of the call. But the biggest takeaway for me was discovering this stuff was first of all, I'll say this: I had to read everything written about Crowley, all the academic stuff, all of the biographies, and that was an interesting exercise in and of itself, to see what people focused on and what they talked about, and how it was different from one biography to another. The vast amount of details that were incorrect. The academic stuff, a mixed bag. There's some good stuff there, but it was only ever going to remain superficial, really, I think. And then the work itself was, I mentioned this term like excavation work. So like I would read all of that stuff and then try to track the trajectory of his life and what he was engaged in. And I found something similar, and this is one of the interesting things, between everything that had been written about Crowley and Crowley's life, which was just like the people who have commented on his life and written about him and so on. Crowley was as much trapped in the details of his life as those looking in from the outside.
Yeah.
So there's this profound aspect, I think, that's underappreciated with Crowley, which is the role that faith played in his life. How from the moment he received the book, in fact, no, it was earlier than that. Even as a child, he was extraordinarily religious, in the sense that he was always looking for faith in the divine and following that, right? And that meant wrestling. Much is made of his conversion to Satanism. You know, like he decided to follow the devil after his father died when he was like 11 or something like this. But he flip-flopped. You know, to the extent that he was interested in the devil and conjuring the devil to learn the secrets of the world, right? He had this faith in Christ, and it kept evolving over time, and that ran all the way through his life, even past the reception of the Book of the Law, into 1906 when he was doing his Holy Guardian Angel stuff. He was still entertaining these ideas around Christ, that kind of a thing. But yes, he receives the Book of the Law, and the Book of the Law is veiled, so he receives this veiled instruction. He's doing this magic, which he doesn't fully understand, because we could say, for a number of reasons. The way that it's presented is the early days of research into the material, because the material he was working with came through the Golden Dawn, which was an institution that was looking back to the ancient past for magical practices that we might say was an expression of an authentic Western spirituality, as a reaction primarily to Blavatsky's theosophy, which had this Eastern orientation. Yeah, so the research around that stuff and the translations and so on, they weren't that great. I mean, it's a mixed bag. He had a kind of an intuitive approach to magic. He sort of felt what he understood to be correct, and didn't have this. He didn't get trapped in the details in a naive sense, which I think a lot of people do when it comes to practices. He understood what was important about them, what was, the essential factor. But nevertheless, he does this practice, this Bornless ritual. He receives the Book of the Law, talking about different gods, from what's described in the Bornless ritual. You have Rahal, Kuit, and Hadit, and Nuit, and so on. But he has this faith, and he follows this path, even though it's described in terrible terms in the book when he receives the book. And this lasts for his entire life. Even when he reconciles himself to the content of the book, to the role, how to orient himself with that process, he never learns the truth about the nature of the deity that was invoked. Using the Bornless rite, that kind of a thing. Now, I want to be clear. He never learns the truth in the sense of it making sense in superficial terms. Right? He nevertheless had profound realization, going through that process. Absolutely. He was as what can we say, as fully realized or enlightened or as spiritual as any of the other saints that people might, hold up in his place or as a good example, of someone who's enlightened, like Ramana Maharshi or, people of that nature. Because it's often the case, people say that he didn't, he made great mistakes, Crowley, and he went mad and so on. As I show in my research, to the contrary, to the contrary, and the details are there to demonstrate this.
Painfully sane. Yeah.
Yes. So right. So yes. So him having to proceed on faith alone, he was going to find no comfort or no explanation in the surface details of his life, and he was told everyone will hate him, he will be betrayed, and so on. But he makes this choice, and that's all he's got to go on is the faith aspect of it. And I find that what can I say? It's an extraordinary example to set.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary example to set. So there's that, and it's almost saying it's not actually important as a practitioner that you actually understand what's going on.
No.
We think that it is, right? That you have to make sense of it, and that it's good that you have a theory to explain what it is that you're doing and a strategy for going forwards. These kinds of things. The more the process proceeds, the darker the world appears, the more you find yourself only able to rely on that expression of faith or saying yes to something, right, that exists over an horizon such that you can't see it, but you're going to say yes to it. You know that there's something bigger, there's something more profound, and you're going to say yes to that. And he served in that regard then. It's like he's not going to understand what's going on, and it's going to be a bad time, but he's serving some kind of function, and he's saying yes to serving that function, even if he doesn't really understand what it means. Yeah. The second thing I would say that was the takeaway from that is the stuff that's revealed in the work that's going to be in Magic Without Tears, and the stuff that I presented in the talk, that came along not because I was interested in proposing theory about Crowley or something like that. And in fact, I wanted to spend the last year doing something else completely different. Right, but the situation arose where I ended up going in that direction. I knew saying yes to the same thing. Oh, I'm supposed to go in. I'm supposed to do this now. It was a phenomenal amount of work. There was a cost to doing that work. But the sense was, oh, this is supposed to be revealed now. This is what is supposed to happen, right? So the sense is, this stuff happened over almost 100 years ago, depending on when you want to, start the story. It's taken a century, almost a century, 80 years, a century. And now it's appropriate that certain things are known.
Yeah.
Now it's appropriate. That's a different time scale. That's a different schedule. Something's working at a different schedule to what we think. Usually we think it should be the other way around. The universe is going to work to my schedule,
No, we are. I've had some it's really interesting that you say that. I've had some intriguing conversations with a bunch of different practitioners who are very good at what they do, who have effectively said, it's more like the spirits are conjuring us at the moment, that we've been given work to do, and there's other things in play that we need to be a part of.
So it brings up this question as a practitioner, which is, would you still say yes to what you claim you want to say yes to? Right? Would you still say yes if it means none of it will make any sense or come to fruition in your lifetime? Would you still say yes to it? Right? And that's a different proposition from what I think most people think magic is about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Usually they start with thinking, I'm going to say yes to something because I'm going to get everything that I've decided I should get or have. One of which is, a more profound understanding of what it is that's going on.
I think you can see that, that element of faith when Crowley's, riding across China and doing the Bornless over and over again, which you can find all over the place. Magic Without Tears will have it. Jake Stratton-Kent's pamphlet on the Headless Rite also makes mention of it as well. And that idea that he almost seems worried that he can't accomplish what he's trying to do, not for himself, but for the spirit. That he's managed to make the Bornless almost like an act of desperation, because he wants to fulfill that, even though he's not going to see it. And of course, if you're not going to see the results, then how do you know that you succeeded? And I think that is definitely a question of faith.
Yeah, well, and but the him riding on his pony across China, doing the Bornless right. He starts that working not to achieve spiritual realization for himself.
Mm.
He starts that working because he accepts what the book has described him as, the apostle of infinite space, right? That's come to teach mankind. And it's like, what is it? What have I come to teach them? Oh, it's this method. Well, I better realize the nature of that method to teach.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's the wrong way around to how people normally talk about it. Normally, people concern themselves with questions of, did he really do it right? Can you really do it on a pony? Does it count if you're doing it astrally? He doesn't do it in the house prescribed by Abramelin. Does the samadhi count at the end because he uses a bit of hashish? Is it a real result? These questions.
Yeah.
Whereas the samadhi's already happened in 1904, the first one, right? It's already happened. It's already been given freely. He already has the title of what he is, and it's a nice callback to what I said at the beginning of this conversation, which is, and hence why the term prophetic is the right word for it.
Yes.
Because he's putting into words something that's already the case, that he already knows, that he already participates in. Yeah, and then that work comes after it, and the work might be, putting it into words, literally writing books about it and that kind of a thing. But practice, and this is how we think about it in Magia, practice is also an equivalent of putting something into words. It's what the practice is. So there he is, doing his holy guardian angel work on his pony for 9 months. That's like a process of putting something into words that he already participates in or knows fundamentally, even if, and this is a complicating factor with Crowley, there's a dissociative attitude that's come along with it, and he's struggling with it. Yes, and even when he's doing the work for that 9 months, there is a period at the beginning there where he's still struggling with faith. He's still struggling with faith. He goes to see one of his magical sisters in the Golden Dawn in Shanghai, hoping that she'll tell him that the Book of the Law is a load of rubbish, and that he could just forget about it and not have to deal with it anymore. Yeah. Unfortunately, she says it's amazing.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So okay, well, coming back to those practices, Dr. Bob Plymouth describes doing stuff in your head as noetic practice. I think there was the early question about simplification, and that you have to kind of have competency over a practice, over a skill, before you can reduce it down. So Danny, I think you wanted to ask some questions about some of the other practices in Magia, perhaps.
Well, this is see, one of the things that really, when I was back in the day, was your approach to the HGA. When you kind of took all of I was reading all this. I wanted to achieve this thing. I wanted to make contact with the Holy Guardian Angel, and I was reading the Headless Rite, and I was doing other things, and then you come up with this very beautiful method, which was based around centering prayer.
I just ripped off Father Thomas Keating. I mean, I can't really take credit.
Indeed. And I was going to say to you, it's about bloody time the air was cleared. We all know it wasn't you, Chapman.
Yeah, what's he going to do? Forgive you?
No. Yeah. But that approach you had, that wonderful, relaxing approach you had, and it carried over into things like the camel rides again, the blue one, the camel rides again.
Yeah.
And all this wonderful stuff. And then it seems to kind of refined itself down again to the beloved practice in Magia. Would that be a correct assumption?
I think it might look a bit like that from the outside, and that's a fine starting point. But it's not.
I'm on the outside looking at it.
Yeah. It's not quite. It's not wrong to say that, but it's a more sophisticated view is understanding that, yes, the beloved practice is an expression of that type of relationship with the divine self, is that you understand it in this analogy that we use of the beloved, right? A relationship with the beloved, the virtue of which, by the way, is for you to then consider how you normally relate to this idea of divine self, realizing your own fundamental nature, this divine self, right? How do you normally relate to it? If it was a romantic relationship, how would you describe how you are relating to it, right? And is that how you would relate to a beloved? And so it's a nice way of orienting yourself. This understanding that it's a beloved. It's also a nice way of understanding the nature of spiritual dramas you might find yourself in when you're relating to reality as if when you have certain experiences with the reality and you think that maybe it's uncaring or that it's making you go through challenging experiences for your own benefit or
that one, Jesus.
things of this nature, or the process of waking up eventually is your annihilation. You're going to be annihilated. That's the point, is to be annihilated and all this other stuff. You can ask yourself then, okay, if this was a beloved, a romantic relationship, what kind of a beloved would it be? Now, of course, you can do this with other analogies. A good one is a parent and child. What kind of a parent would it be? But yes, we use the beloved one, and it can be quite insightful if you do that. And it should stand to reason that you're not interested in a beloved that's a psychopath, or a transactional relationship, right? A transactional relationship, like the beloved is a prostitute, and you're a client, right? And you're doing a trade, or something like this. You can look at these analogies and say, is this what the relationship really is? Is this what I'm interested in? Is this what I think I'm doing? That kind of a thing. Right, but in terms of this tradition, in terms of what Crowley was doing with the Bornless ritual or the headless rite, which he practices from the get-go. It's what he learns about practical magic, and it's what he does from the beginning. This invocation of this headless god. That practice has more in common with the Magia prayer, which is what we say before we do what's called an unbinding practice, of which the beloved practice is one example. There's 3 of them. It has more in common with that than it does necessarily with just that beloved practice. But like I said, with the analogy, you can see it located in the beloved practice. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think it's really interesting the way we turn those relationships. So, for my many poor life choices and misadventures, I ended up taking the Oath of the Abyss in May 2023, and that is, hence the big stupid tattoo. And it is definitely that relationship with Babylon as part of my practice in a devotional fashion. I think the point about transactional relationships with whatever it is out there that you're connecting with is so important, especially with the you sort of your newer generation of TikTok and Instagram, like witchcraft and influencers or witchfluencers or whatever you want to call it, where it's all about the this is what you get for doing the thing. And I think that one of the key things in Magia and the other works that you've written is obviating that transactional relationship, because it's not going to bear out, as we've been saying about Crowley.
Yeah, I mean, there's you can say we always start off from a transactional position. We kind of can't help it. It's the structure of things, but we're not interested in staying there. So you might decide, if I'm going to do a practice, there's a reason you're going to do the practice, and it's practical. It's like a strategy. You're going to get something out of it. However, if it's a good practice, we have a correction to our orientation from doing the practice. Now there are plenty of entities and plenty of things that you can do that are transactional. The question is, what are we interested in? What is it that we're interested in? Are we interested in that nature that is, so intimate that it knows us better than we know ourselves? Is that what we're interested in? Well, if we're interested in that, then what must be our relationship with it? Right? Is a transactional relationship the best way of describing it? Is it that type, or is it something else? Yes. So for sure, it's you can get trapped in that place where everything is transactional. You indulge your transactional tendencies, that kind of a thing, and you have to encounter that even if you're interested in something that's beyond the transactional, right? You have to encounter that first. But there's that sense that this isn't it. This isn't the thing that I'm looking for. Practically speaking, if you're doing practical magic, you might say instead, you do your practical magic. How many times do you have to do a magical working, get the result, before you start to notice something that doesn't fit your idea of what practical magic is? Like, am I really getting that which I'm interested in? Is what I'm interested in, have I identified it correctly? Do I even know what I want? Am I even capable of putting into words what it is I think that will fulfill me in the most fundamental sense? Can I do that? Now, unfortunately, a lot of people don't get to that point to ask those questions, and magic ends up looking like a means just for perpetuating one's own problems. And it just, it's like it's just spinning your wheels, right?
Yeah, going through a loop.
Yeah, while the nature of your life takes a nosedive.
Yeah,
things just progressively get worse.
It is,
Yeah.
and I think that's an important quality of a magician, to notice when the rituals, the work they're doing. I've nothing against like practical enchantment for particular results, but if you don't notice that those things aren't having the outcomes and that something needs to change, then I think you really missed a step as a magician, and that's when it's time to investigate deeper and probably look within to your relationship with your spirits.
In Magia, in the order, we actually teach it the other way around, so that we start off with the Magia practices, the unbinding practices, and so on, which you might describe as a type of meditation or an invocation. But in the inner order, in the final grade, we then train people in practical magic, and a very particular kind of practical magic, a very old approach to it. But yes, we do it that way around, instead of the practical first and then the esoteric stuff after.
I was actually going to ask about the binding stuff,
Right.
because that's the only part in the in Magia where I think a little more guidance. Well, I'm quite good at gleaning stuff from the written word, and that was the only place where I get this. It needs to be more experiential. Is that something you can sort of riff on now, or
Yeah, I mean, that's intentional. So I believe that the method of binding practice is best learned in person with someone else who can do it. So that's why the order exists. It's part of the order. So if you want to learn binding practice, the best way to do it is with people that already know how to do it. Those people are in the order. It's the problem. It goes back to what I mentioned before. As soon as you speak, you can bind people, right? So that they misunderstand what you're talking about. You talk and you confuse people, right? So there was an element of that before Magia came along. There was a version of what we call binding practice, sort of developing. And I mentioned I had this interactive gaming, learning gaming, gamified platform thing called Wiser by Design. There was a form on there, 150 videos to teach you how to do it. And you went through it step by step, right? You get badges for learning each part, that kind of a thing. But what happened was because of the limitations of a form, right? So there's certain things, if you're not interacting with a human being, the form has to prompt you to think about certain things. That people then took that as part of the practice when it's not.
Right.
And and then I started to realize, wow, I've built something that's a parody of a teacher. It's a dead form on a website. It's a parody of what a teacher is. Yeah. So it was intentional with the order. It's best learned in person. Saying all of that, there are teaching instructions in the order that at some point will become books or other materials available for people who need more, who need more. But yes, it's best learned in person. For people listening who don't have a clue what these practices are, I will just give a brief overview. So the first practice that you learn is called unbinding. Now, these terms unbinding and binding, there's this ancient understanding of magic, the magical act, where there's only two things possible. You can either bind something or you can unbind it, and there isn't anything else. That's it. So you can basically understand any kind of practical magic from these two basic categories. In Magia, we have unbinding practice. What's being unbound, and what do we mean by that? with unbinding practice, we are unbinding eternity from time, or we're unbinding reality from appearance. And there's different ways of cutting this, different language to use, but another way, it's like unbinding the light from the darkness, unbinding who you really are from the falsehood you take yourself to be. That can be another way of putting it. Now, you could flip the language around and say, really what you're doing is you're binding eternity into time. You could flip it around that way. So it's a question of what do we want to emphasize? So with unbinding, I decided with this practice, which is where we lie down and we do a type of meditation practice, we're unbinding who and what we really are in this world as human beings. And that's the process of waking up or the great work, so on and so forth. The next practice is called binding practice, right? Same thing applies with the terminology. You could look at it 2 different ways, but binding practice, what do we do? With binding practice, we invite the shadows cast into time through our incarnation, what we would normally call the playing out of dramas or roles, the playing out of our falsehoods or our delusions, the problems that we have. We invite those to turn up during the practice, and we then capture what that shadow or that drama looks like. So it can manifest as like a daydream or an interruption to your practice. Sometimes physically, like if you do the invitation and then you're doing the practice, and on the phone rings and you have to answer it, that drama is an example of the shadow in question. But yes, dreams, visions, dramas. We then make a drawing of that when we capture the details, using words, basic symbols, that kind of a thing. We want to get a sequence in time. So if we have a daydream, it's like how it begins, what you actually experience, the emotional states you go through, that kind of a thing. And if we get the sequence in time right, it suggests other examples from your life. And what you find is you can trace it back to its origin. And doing that practice, we give the playing out of a false transmission, usually from the past. I don't want to get too technical or complicated, but usually from the past, handed down through the family, sometimes through the culture. We give the playing out of that role its real name, such that we can't believe it anymore. The false transmission that we see, we can't believe it anymore, and we can say that it's the shadow's been taken back to its origin, where it came from, or we've resolved a problem, or something like this, and it doesn't manifest again. Right. So binding practice is what we do when going through this process using unbinding practice. Right. That's our main daily meditation practice. We do that practice. We encounter personal problems from our past that will turn up. There'll be a number of those. Binding practice is a way to help us travel through them by resolving them. And at some point, though, we'll get to what's called an existential shadow. It doesn't have its origin in this world with a false transmission. It's something that's already in place to make incarnation possible. Right. I don't want to get too esoteric, but our personal shadows have their origin in a false transmission in the past. An existential shadow or a spiritual shadow is actually the shadow of a true transmission in the future, or an awakening that's happening in the future. And it gets resolved by an awakening, right? And this pattern of personal problems, then an existential one, then an awakening, just keeps repeating itself. And there are stages to waking up. There's more than one kind of awakening. And they form what we call in Magia the circle of creation. And we understand it with the analogy of a mountain, traveling up a mountain and back down again into a forest. All of this is described in my book Magia.
Mm-hmm.
So, unbinding practice, that's like the daily meditation. Binding practice, you could say that's like dealing with our shadows, dealing with our problems to help us move through them or resolve them.
Almost
Right.
an exorcism.
Right. Yeah. And it's called binding because it's like we're binding the problem, the shadow, the false belief, onto the page, and spelling it out so that what you end up with is something that looks like a magical tablet from the ancient world.
Cartouche.
Right. Yes. And so you can think of it that way. But we could easily have called it unbinding practice, like we're being unbound from our shadows, something like that. Again, it's what do you want to emphasize? What you're interested in emphasizing. So unbinding and binding, it's the primary magical act. There's you can only do two there's only two things you can do magically speaking in the broadest sense in terms of categories. If you wanted to think about it in purely practical magical terms, unbinding is like the highest form of enchantment, the equivalent of which might be from the recent past the invocation of the Holy Guardian Angel. So instead of doing specific workings for specific magical results that we're interested in, instead we turn to the angel, and then the angel provides us with practical magical results that we didn't even have to ask for. And it's more fulfilling than we could have guessed in terms of what it is that comes down the pipeline, such that we could even formulate a sentence to ask for it. So, yes, unbinding is like a highest form of enchantment. Binding practice is like the highest form of divination, because what we look at is if we have a problem of whatever the nature might be, that problem, like what's the best way of navigating this circumstance, so on and so forth. You're traveling through a drama. Well, what's the nature of the drama? Right. What's the wisest way of relating to what it is that I'm experiencing? Right. And binding practice is how we look at dreams, we look at visions, we look at spiritual experiences, and so on. And it leads you back to the wisest orientation. And not only that, but it does it in a way where the problem is resolved. Yeah, there's another version of binding practice specifically about identifying spiritual experience as well. So I don't know if that was too, what can I say? Was that unclear, or did that make sense?
No, not at all. That was one that made perfect sense. Yeah.
And then there's the third practice that I talked about. It's called incubating practice. With incubating practice, it's difficult to describe. There's an orientation to it to do it properly. There's no real method, but it involves traveling into the underworld to meet the goddess. And it's it's the preferred approach, or the highest form, if you like, of doing specific practical workings within the Magia framework. Yes, there will be literature in the future where I describe that method and talk about it in depth, but it's not in the Magia book for a reason.
Yeah.
I
think the unbinding practice and that making a connection, almost like the Holy Guardian Angel work, where things turn up, for one of our results manifest that couldn't have been formulated in order for you to to continue your practice and to continue the work. I think that's very resonant with my understanding of Thelemic practice, that if you end up in a devotional relationship and you devote yourself to doing your will through the Thelemic current, then you'll be brought to the place where you can do those things no matter what. And that's certainly been my experience of it, ups and downs along the way. So I think that's really clear and concise method of approaching that, which I think is brilliant.
Well, the other thing I love about your stuff is, for example, who knows Thelema that only Thelema knows? Do you know what I mean? You've got taken in a broad spectrum of practice over the years, and you've gone into Buddhism, and you've gone into non-duality. And I love the way that your work seems to be a place where non-duality and magic meet. I mean, I know there's non-duality in magic. I don't mean that, but what I mean in terms of practice, where this is stuff you've talked about and come up with. I love the fact that it's very what's the word I'm looking for? Relaxed, almost like your approach to things is very meditative. Would that be fair? And very almost intuitive, yeah, like it's very much you make yourself available rather than. Am I being correct here or wrong? Or
yeah, I think it makes sense what you're saying, Danny. The starting point with Magia is it disclose their own nature, and that includes yourself. So allowing yourself to disclose your own nature, rather than indulging ideas about who and what you think you are. Instead, if it's already the case, if it's already true, you can just allow it to reveal itself, right? So much so that it takes that burden away of thinking that there is some kind of absence of detail or information that you have to make up for, some missing knowledge or something like this. If you're already how you are, right, then all we have to do is navigate the details of our own life, right, and we can allow it to disclose its own nature. You already know somehow what it is that you're looking for, even if you can't put it into words. And all you have are competing voices, right, from appearance, from your culture, from yourself sometimes, right, or your problems or whatever, that tell you that faith in something greater is too good to be true, or isn't real, or something like this, or that you have to make sense of things beforehand before you can proceed in any direction or whatever. But if we can allow ourselves to disclose our own nature, we will discover that there's something, if we're conscious of it, there's something bigger than this. There's something beyond appearances. I don't know what it is. Am I going to say yes to it or not? To appreciate the absence of something must mean that at some point we knew that thing. We knew that thing. And again, we use the beloved analogy because often this is described as a type of longing or something like that for someone or something that we love and have this sense that we're loved by. Now, you can't miss a beloved if we haven't already been in love with that beloved, right? So that's why it's a knowing. Silent because we don't know what the words are to describe it. And this is the impetus that has to come first before we learn all the language of spirituality and the practices and that kind of a thing. And often what happens is we learn a language or we become part of a tradition or something like that. And then the terms of that tradition become substitutes for that silent knowing. So when people get to the point where they say, I'm interested in awakening or non-duality or something like this, they're not really interested in awakening or non-duality. These are words for something that we think best expresses this silent knowing, and it's searching for something. And so the discovery of that which we're looking for, the resolution of that longing, that's what awakening would be, or non-duality or something like this. And then you can get tied up in the details, like, how do I wake up in the best way? What is awakening really? What's non-duality? But it's all a proxy for something else. Yes. So if that's the case, and we understand that, I already have everything that I need, and actually this is the nature of creation, or what it means to be incarnated, is that you're presented with this option. You can say yes to, you can remain with this world with an inheritance you didn't ask for, right? Which seems to be forced on you, which makes no sense, right? You're just confused, you're lost, right? You can just remain there, or you can say yes to this something else that you know to be true, even though you don't know what it is, right? In a human sense, right? That you can articulate. And it's not forced on you. It's not forced on you, but you are asked. You can say yes. And if you say yes, that's you saying yes to participating in what's going on here in a conscious fashion. Now, maybe you say no, and like a lot of people, you're not even aware that you're presented with that choice, right? And that's fine. So you're not going to be forced to participate in creation in any way, right? It's almost as if it cares. That must be a fundamental part of things. There's something that cares about that, right? That's strange, right? But conscious participation, okay. And then the conscious participation is in a process that's already happening for everyone anyway, which is why when we talk about awakening, right, you find in the literature in certain traditions this talk of that awakening being synonymous with death. Sometimes you'll hear a phrase which is dying whilst you're still alive, or dying before you die. And that's one way of understanding what profound realization is. That's just another way of saying, isn't it, that you're consciously engaging in this process of incarnation in a way that it becomes more fruitful, more efficient, makes more sense, and you do it. You do what you've come here to do, and you do it in the most expedient fashion, and then you experience what's on the other side of death while still alive, right? And that's and that's a process by degrees, but that's what it is. Now, to me, if you understand all of that from your nature disclosing itself, it's either there or it isn't. That structure's there or it isn't. Right? You either recognize the silent knowing in your life or you don't. You either recognize that the silent knowing will be expressed as actual events in your life where maybe you're presented with a choice, where you act out saying yes to this thing, right, or saying no to it and going in a different direction. Yeah. Either it's there or it isn't. And if it is there, then you're already, all it takes is saying yes to it. You recognize it, you say yes to it. The rest of it is just an outgrowth of that saying yes. And when we talk about faith, what do we mean by faith? It's trust in that silent knowing. That's what faith means. Trust in the silent knowing. Just saying yes to it. You start there, that's where you're going to end up, right? And the details will become richer and so on. And we have these events that we talk about, but the orientation is there at the beginning. It's very simple. And it should be there all the way through. If you don't lose the orientation, you don't have anything to worry about. So maybe that's where the sense of it being kind of relaxed comes from, maybe. But it is as simple as just orienting yourself. You know, it does, everything that's in Magia is a way of putting into words that process that you go through that orientation. That's what it is, and it can get very sophisticated and so on, so such that it eventually looks simple, but it is simple, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we've covered pretty much the entirety of theurgic practice there in one simple hit. That was brilliant. Thank you, Alan. So we'll probably come to a close there, so people can get all the way through the video. And I just really want to thank you both. It's been spectacular.
Thank you for organising it.
Well,
and thank you, Alan. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
So this is the Visible College's podcast, Sorcerous Intent, which is available on all sorts of platforms. And this with other videos is at visible-college.org. So, Alan, your website is barbarouswords.com.
Yep.
Your published works are available through aeonbooks.co.uk. And Danny is not just my wonderful guest on the show, he also hosts his own channel on YouTube where he talks to various magical people, looks at books, including Alan Moore's Big Bumper Book of Magic, and has wonderful thoughts to say on the right side of mad on YouTube. So from myself and the rest of Visible College, thank you both so much, and I look forward to speaking to you next time we see each other.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.